What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another Retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and this is going to be another one of my discussion videos. I've been really happy at the reception to those videos, and I think that they've produced some very insightful conversations and debates in the comments, so let's just keep them going. Today I'm going to talk about a topic that's come to mind in playing a bit more of Yada, because Yada released something monumental in the game's history, and that is the first actual official archetype that the game ever had. And so that got me thinking about the differences between modern deck building and DM era deck building. And, you could argue also, DM deck building had a lot of one-ofs and weird ratios that modern deck building has sort of moved away from, things like that. But what I more mean is just the general differences in how you can even deck build in each era, because, even if you apply the sort of modern theory crafting behind modern decks to the old DM era, there are going to be some things that you can't actually do if you want to make a good deck here. So let's just get into it and talk about what makes DM era decks different. So in front of you, I put up a deck, in Yada format, which is the format that I'm currently covering. And this deck is one of the best decks in the format. Maybe not this build of it, this is my personal build of it, but this is Hand Control. And Hand Control is a deck that it does play some sort of not archetypal, but specific cards. So for instance, Reinforced from the Army is a card that synergizes with the warriors in the deck, and only the warriors. And you could potentially build a bigger warrior deck, potentially playing things like Gearfried, the Iron Knight with Blast with Chain, and some other warriors like that. But besides that, this deck is mainly just a bunch of good stuff cards put together into a pile. And because some of the monsters in this deck do have a hand control effect, and Yada is also in this deck to serve as sort of a win condition if you deplete your opponent's hand size down, this deck is known as Hand Control. Now, you can definitely go more in on the hand control, and I might feature a deck doing that in future videos, playing things like Drop Off, Time Seal, etc. I showed that off in Fiber format as well. But a lot of good decks in the era sort of fall into this sort of category if you want to make them optimal. Because I think that this deck is probably better than if you sort of go all in on time seals and drop-offs, etc. And it's just basically a good stuff pile, as I said. And that sort of deck building may not appeal to all people, but that is a sort of deck building that you find in the DM era quite a bit. And I do think it's kind of an interesting thing to note, especially given that in Yada format, we now have our first archetype. So you'd expect more people to sort of play that archetype. And to be fair, in my Discord, many people have been experimenting a lot with Gravekeepers. However, when it comes to these old-fashioned archetypes that were released around the DM era, it is very, very different from what you normally think of as a modern sort of archetype. So let's just explore Gravekeepers a bit to discuss what I mean by that. So this is the sort of page that I use to talk about Gravekeepers in my Yada format guide a couple of videos ago. And this sort of just shows all the different Gravekeepers cards in this set and all the cards that could potentially relate to the Gravekeepers here. Now, thematically, the Gravekeepers have a clear theme revolving around Necro Valley, and that theme is stopping the dead from rising from the grave. So Necro Valley prevents your opponent from, and you as well, from actually using cards that would, do things to cards in the graveyard. And this combats the sort of zombie strategy that the Pharaonic Guardian set also introduced with things like Book of Life and Pyramid Turtle, etc. Although this doesn't stop Pyramid Turtle, but, it stops the revival aspect of zombies. However, if you look at the individual cards beyond Necro Valley, they don't really fit to this theme, and honestly, they're a bit of a hodgepodge. A lot of them just have generic utility effects, like Spear Soldier inflicts piercing damage, Guard can return a monster to your opponent's hand after being flipped, Spy can bring out another Gravekeepers from deck. But if you go beyond that, it's kind of weird. Assailant is the only one that actually synergizes directly with Necro Valley being on field, although Gravekeeper's Chief also mentions it, except shutting down Necro Valley for yourself. So it doesn't really synergize with it in that way. But besides that, you could potentially play a Gravekeeper's deck not playing Necro Valley at all. Now, of course, there's also Royal Tribute, which is a card that you can pair with Necro Valley, but it doesn't actually relate to Gravekeepers specifically. The Gravekeepers deck isn't really about hand control, although you could argue with Gravekeeper's Guard. A combo you can do is flip up Gravekeeper's Guard, return a monster to your opponent's hand, and then Royal Tribute to discard it away. That might be an intended synergy that, the designers had here. But besides that interaction, this card kind of feels a little bit weird, especially in a format where there are other much better hand-controlled decks. And if you look deeper at the other cards that the Gravekeepers include, it gets even weirder. Like, Gravekeeper's Candleholder and Gravekeeper's Curse imply that the deck should be going for a sort of burn strategy, and Gravekeeper's Vassal also fits into this in the worst way possible. Like, this card is absolutely terrible, but it does inflict burn damage, so you could potentially go for a burn version of Gravekeepers. But you could also just go for a generic version, using Necro Valley to buff up your monsters, maybe doing some hand control with Guard and Tribute. Like, I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what form they wanted this deck to take. And that makes it a lot different from more modern archetypes. Like, a lot of modern archetypes, you sort of know what the game plan is from the individual cards. And of course, you know, as more cards get introduced to an archetype, it can potentially turn that archetype away from its original goal. But when most archetypes come out, you can read them and be like, okay, so this is what this archetype is trying to do. This will appeal to me if I like this sort of style of gameplay. And if I don't, this archetype probably isn't for me. And that's the case with a lot of future archetypes in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. I think like around the late GX era and throughout the 5Ds era, they really sort of started to hammer home what an archetype actually is and, you know, why you should potentially be playing it. However, at this stage in the game's history, this was their first outing. They just thought, you know, let's just put a bunch of cards together with the same name that can pair with a sort of synergistic card here. Also, Ready Spirit does synergize with all the Gravekeepers as well. But besides that, it's like very, very much a hodgepodge. And that sort of ties into the good stuff philosophy that we saw from just a generically good deck. I mean, that deck was just a bunch of individually strong cards, and you could argue that a lot of the Gravekeepers are the same way. Just cards that are individually strong, that sort of all share this common unifying theme. But that makes it a lot harder to make archetype-focused decks in these old DM era formats. And I think that's a big reason why you don't really see them if you go back and look at decks from around this time. Now, of course, because they're archetypes and because, you know, your brain releases the happy chemicals when you're playing a strategy with a bunch of cards that sort of synergize well together, you're going to want to play them, and a lot of people have wanted to play them. I myself want to play them as well. I want to figure out a fun brew of Gravekeepers that I feel like can be the deck at its best, but the archetype definitely is not holding my hand and telling me this is the way to play it. And that applies to a lot of decks in the DM era format, and it's one of the reasons why a lot of people have a lot of fun deck building in formats from this time. And there are just so many ways to go, so much flexibility. At this point in the game's history, you really were meant to mash up different cards together that don't necessarily share the same theme. You know, you could have a three-eyed like monster in your deck, the same deck that has like sort of like nurse with a giant needle that, you know, can poke in your opponent for big damage. Like, you can fit all these sort of discordant designs and ideas together into one deck, and that can be pretty fun when you're playing it, and it can give each card its own unique sort of identity. So it's kind of a cool feature of this time. But also it can definitely not appeal to some people as well. Like, I'm sure that a lot of people get decision paralysis when facing these sorts of decks, especially when it comes to cutting cards. I mean, I know myself, I have a lot of trouble sort of cutting out good cards from a deck that I'm building in this format. I mean, honestly, I think the good stuff pile decks are probably the easiest to start making. I think that they're deceptively hard to optimize, but when you're first like sitting down and putting together a good stuff pile, you know, you just fit in the good cards and you're like, okay, my philosophy behind this deck is we're cutting the bad cards. And, you know, those bad cards can be difficult to determine, but, you know, you don't necessarily have to make the hard decisions of, do I cut these hand rips? Does this deck actually want to play them? Or, you know, things like that. So I do think that it's a very interesting sort of era of deck building that I encourage people to try out if they haven't done this. Like, if they're only really used to the modern game and having these archetypes that they can just build around, I encourage you to look back at old formats and try your hand at building some decks. I think that you'll find that there's a lot of room for creativity, and that can be very, very rewarding, especially when you put together a deck made up of cards that, you know, maybe the format as a whole doesn't really look fondly on, and you actually do well with it. So let me know down in the comments below what you think of this sort of change in design philosophy around these sorts of decks. I know that this wasn't really as opinionated a video that I normally make with these sorts of discussions. I'm sort of trying something new, starting this as sort of a jumping off point for discussion. And I look forward to talking with y'all in the comments down below about this and what your thoughts on this are, and also what your experiences are in deck building in this format and also in later formats. So I look forward to talking with you as always. If you enjoy this sort of content and want to see some games in these old formats, then definitely subscribe to the channel. I release a lot of videos showing off gameplay with both, the sort of general good stuff decks and also these sort of off meta decks in these old formats. It's always a lot of fun, so definitely check those out if you're interested. And of course, do leave a like down below if you enjoyed the video. It really does help out a lot. But I look forward to discussing with y'all as always, and until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'll see you next time.